today is from James 1. Count it all joy whenever you fall into various trials. And if you all haven't heard, the neighbor's tree fell on Janie's house and major damage, so she won't be here today. So we need to be praying for her. But thankfully, she wasn't hurt. Okay, Jane. Now, remember last week we kind of set the stage for our study. And today, as we're diving in, I want us to look specifically, and I'll read these verses 2 through 4. We're going to be looking at verses 2 through 4. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. And so as we begin the study of James, remember we talked about how many things he's going to address that we might consider very practical in Christian living. So that our theme for this study is the powerful and practical faith. And isn't it interesting to think in terms of James starting the letter off about how we're to face trials? Would you say that the average person has trials in their life? The thing I like about the way that he words this, he describes it as various trials. And when you start thinking about all the various trials that we all have, of what we have to go through, it's almost like the sky is the limit, isn't it? I mean, you start listing. Here's the interesting thing. Think about all of the trials you've had just the last month or two. And we're going to talk about why those trials are necessary. And James is going to talk about it because there might be a perspective in life where you could say, well, wouldn't life be easier if we didn't have to go through these trials? So James is going to address this, and he seems to bring together two things that don't make sense for us: joy and misery. Count it all joy when you go through various trials. So how do you bring those two together? Well, I've often thought when I think of that question, the perfect answer is Jesus as the model. If you have your Bibles, turn over to Hebrews 12, verse 2. And I love how the writer of the book of Hebrews is going to give us the model of Jesus in trying to pull these two dynamics together. But Hebrews 12:2, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. You see, Jesus kept in mind this bigger picture. He knew there was more at stake than just the misery that he was going through. And so that joy of being part of God's plan kept his own trials in perspective. So we can count it all joy when we go through these kind of trials too, if we keep the bigger picture in mind. And James is going to give us some of that bigger picture. So I want us to look at it this morning. When he says count it all joy, this idea count, some translations say consider, it's not an unusual word being found within the book of James as what we call the New Testament wisdom literature. Wisdom calls upon us to reflect on life. So to consider it all joy when you fall into various trials, it makes us ask the question today, have I taken the time to consider the various trials I've been through? Have I taken the time to reflect on them? And then to see if my faith will help me look upon those experiences such that there's an inner joy that can come out of that. And so from the perspective of New Testament wisdom literature, James being that letter of the New Testament, I'm not surprised that this is what first comes up. Consider, reflect, take time to think through what you've been through. Have you ever had this experience? You have some kind of trial and you think back on it and you ask yourself the question, what did I learn from this? What did I learn from this? There was a book many, many years ago published called The University of Hard Knocks. And we kind of have that language come into our vernacular, so to speak, so that if somebody says, yeah, I learned that lesson through the University of Hard Knocks. Well, you know exactly what they're meaning when they say that. And here's the other thing. When we go through life and we face various trials, I think the lessons that we learn are lessons we don't forget. It's one thing to tell me to have a certain perspective or to have a certain kind of behavior or attitude. But if I learned it through a hard lesson of life, I'm not going to forget it. And this is the part of the place of wisdom. Now, in James, we're going to confront two kinds of wisdom, which is fascinating. Because in the Old Testament, you don't get this strong of a flavor. But James is going to say, in this first chapter even, if you lack wisdom, what are you supposed to do? Ask. Supposed to ask God. If you just stay within the strain of the tradition of wisdom, you could almost hear the verse ending up like this. Well, if you lack wisdom, just go out and live and experience a few more trials and then you'll get it. But he doesn't say that. There's an aspect of what, now I want you to think about this, because I've thought long and hard about this before I said it. For those of us who are Christians, there's an aspect of wisdom that is divine gift if we ask for it. And we don't have to experience every single thing in life to get the wisdom we need. Now, when that is in your life, I don't know. He doesn't say, but I suspect that when we get to the point and we're going through some kind of trial and we realize we don't have the background to face that trial, that's when we're driven to our knees in prayer. And we'll say something like, Lord, give me the wisdom to know how to handle this. Well, I believe the Lord honors those kind of prayers. Give me the wisdom. In leadership studies, there's a fascinating perspective on this. Do y'all know what resiliency is? The ability to bounce back is a real short definition of it. When it comes to moral character and its formation, people use the expression resiliency muscle. And it's kind of cool because what that means is when you overcome a trial, guess what? It makes you ready and stronger, ready to meet the next trial. And so you begin to build up resiliency muscle. Remember when the Twin Towers fell in New York? There was a lot of study done and interviews of people who made it through that. And all kinds of ways of people tried to make it through that trial. That was a horrendous trial for people. But there were some people who really didn't have much of a faith, but they somehow made it through. And some of the researchers came up with a fascinating phrase, and it certainly wouldn't be defining how we as Christians go through trials, but he came up with a phrase. He said, well, some people coped ugly. He called it coping ugly, which was fascinating. They barely made it by the skin of their teeth. But for Christians, see, James is going to challenge that kind of mindset so that when we go through various trials, we count it all joy. Really? Well, let's see what he said, because it is such a critical perspective for all of us. When he says, count it all joy, this same idea is used in Philippians 2 to consider Jesus, who gave up his position in heaven and came to earth. And this means Jesus regarded it a joyful thing to give up that position. And in his ministry, he had a joyful perspective that kept him going. And this means that we need to be able to think about our trials from a Christian perspective. And so what we hear James really asking us and his readers, what have you learned from your trials? The things that you've gone through. What have you learned? Why is that important? So let's take a moment and I want to talk about Christian joy. We probably don't talk enough about Christian joy. In 1984, William Morris wrote a little booklet, and I've got it somewhere in my library. I can't find it. It was called Joy in the New Testament. And he highlights 11 different words in the New Testament. They're all synonyms, but they kind of revolve around this idea of joy. Okay. And then he talks about in that little booklet, he goes through the major sections of the New Testament. For example, he'll look at joy in the life of Jesus. That chapter in and of itself is worth the price of the book. Joy in the ministry of Jesus, joy in the other gospels, joy in Paul's epistles. Believe it or not, joy in Revelation. Great chapter on that one. So he walks through the New Testament literature, and then he ends with a chapter called Our Joy in God. And one of the cases that he makes is in the ancient world, there wasn't a whole lot of joy. Many of your philosophers didn't teach. Roman and Greek philosophers, there wasn't a whole lot on joy. There's a lot on fatalism. You know, your cup of life that you got, if you don't like what you're drinking, tough, just sip it down and deal with it. But the Christian perspective comes along and says, no, there is joy. There can be joy in life, even in the midst of all of its trials. And so that's one of the things that we need to understand about how critical joy is. It actually is one of the unique features, yeah, Nancy, of the Christian faith that the ancient world didn't really know much about.
I think we need to understand this isn't just a shallow happiness. You know, oh, I feel so happy.
No.
No, this is a deep,
Mhm.
deep inner feeling that God is in control of everything.
Well,
and
because
all things work together for good.
and because you're saying that, how would you define for us then the difference between joy and happiness?
Happiness is based on circumstances,
Okay.
but joy it's just this amazing deep realization that God is in control of everything, that my past is completely forgiven. My present is supplied with the power of the Holy Spirit, and my future is bright with the hope of heaven.
Okay.
And that kind of joy
Mm-hmm.
is indomitable.
It is.
Nothing can break it down if the Spirit is living in you.
Well, and what it makes us realize, joy doesn't come along and say everything's nice, because everything isn't nice sometimes. But it is an inner state of being that highlights two things. My relationship with God, I can only have this joy because it comes from God. But then the recognition that what's going on out here doesn't define me. I can face it. I don't want to deny it. It's real. It's out there, but it doesn't define me. And as a Christian, I have a different perspective on it. And you're right. Happiness tends to be just the external. If things are going along the way I like for them to, then I'm happy. Well, if I define happiness that way, how many of us can control things so we can be happy? It doesn't work very well, does it? So, yeah, that's a great distinction. So, how do trials test? He says there's various kinds of trials, and what's a trial to one person may not be a trial to another. I'll never forget years and years ago when I took a class on crisis counseling. My teacher said something, and this may be the only thing I remember of the class, but it was so insightful. When you're talking to a person and they bring a problem to you, if it's a crisis to them, don't make fun of it. It's a crisis to them. Now, you may be thinking in your mind, oh my goodness, if they would just get their act together and think this way, that's no problem. Well, to the person coming to you, it is a problem. And you need to respect that and help walk them through that, okay? So the ability then to recognize that all of us, our trials are going to be different, and we have to be aware of that. And here's another thing that occurred to me. We're going to face different kind of trials in different seasons of our life. What really gets my goat now didn't 30 years ago. The things I have to face now that seem to be real trials and real obstacles and real pain, things I have to deal with, it's not what it was 30 years ago. And as we go through our different seasons of life, we have to be prepared faithfully and spiritually and from, our thinking through and from perspective of wisdom, we need to be prepared to think through and be ready for those different kind of trials at different times in our life. Then I love how he says, uh, whenever you face many kinds of trials, because you know. Now he's tapping into the dynamic of wisdom, because you know. And here's what he's saying. Now, what I'm going to bring up, you all have experienced this, so you know this. Wisdom taps into what we know. And isn't it interesting? My brother texted me last month, and I haven't really answered him back. I need to do this. When I turned 71, he goes, "Oh man, you're an old timer now." And then he said, "What lessons have you learned in life?" And I haven't really responded yet, but wisdom looks at your life and says, "What have I learned?" Because James is going to say, because you know. See, what are things that you know? Beyond a shadow of a doubt. You've experienced them and now you know them. And if somebody comes up to you and says, "Well, that's not the way life is," you go, "Whoa, whoa, back the truck up. I experienced it. I know it's this way, at least for me." Maybe it wasn't for you, but don't deny it, because this is what I went through and I know it. It's kind of like you can put the peg down in the ground because this is what you know. So, from the perspective of wisdom, these are lessons that we know. And notice in verse 2, well, actually, yeah, it's in verse 2. The NIV really doesn't translate it the best. Whenever you face trials, the word that is used here is literally fall into. And I get the impression that when you fall into various trials, it's a recognition that most of the time I don't get a vote. Most of the time, when I face trials, I fall into them. They blindside me. I didn't see it coming, and I don't get a vote on it. Okay. So I think that's why he used this word. Because think about it. If I'm walking along and I fall into a hole, why do I typically fall into a hole? I wasn't paying attention. I haven't seen it. I didn't see it. Um, a teacher that I knew at the school where I'm working, one day was walking and he didn't see a big hole in the ground because the grass covered it up. So one evening he's walking, he stepped in that hole and snapped his ankle. And that's what trials can do. They'll catch you unawares. You're not prepared for them. You didn't see it coming. And that's why this word, yeah, James says, whenever you face trials, yeah, we're talking about facing trials, but it's more than that. When you fall into various kind of trials, you didn't ask for them. And here's the other thing. This is huge. When you go through hard times, think of how many times you have the thought. And I've had people really difficult issues in their life wrestling with this one. I don't deserve this. How come God didn't keep this from happening? And for some people's faith, that is a real challenge. But the question can come up: what did I do to deserve this? Well, maybe nothing. It's just a trial because we're living here on earth. You didn't do anything to deserve it. And I love this word for testing. In the ancient world, both the Romans and the Greeks would use this word to talk about testing of metal. Put it in the fire, test it for purity. So let's talk a moment, because this is why he's using this word. Tell me what your thoughts are about the power of trials to purify us. I'll ask the question like that and just kind of let it lay without explanation. How do trials purify us?
If you go through a trial, you have the self-awareness of how you're dealing with it. And if you're flailing and gossiping and trying to get everything to work your way. Sometimes when you look back on that, you think, I didn't go through that trial well. And you have to confess and repent of sin. And then you get right with God. So it is a purifying kind of.
Well, it is.
Depending on the type of trial. Which makes me ask, are these trials that the brethren went through because of persecution of faith? Or does this include every little misery and suffering and trial?
Well, that's a great question. When he says various trials, he's kind of giving a broad brushstroke. But if you look in the book of James later, we'll come across this. You're going to find, here's what it looks like. Later on, Christian employers who own a lot of farm property, they are causing misery and defrauding some of their workers. So in answer to your question, in James, you have a specific example where some of the various trials that some of the workers are having to go through, they're not getting paid enough and their employer's ripping them off. So how do you count that all joy? So, but your question's a great one because it is, this term as it's used here is broad sweeping. So it can be persecution, because he's going to talk about that. It can be things you go through in life that you don't feel like you deserve. I mean, it's just a broad general sweep at this point. Now, what's interesting, he's also going to use this same word to describe a little bit later in chapter 1, the trials of temptations themselves. And you all know that certain temptations can be a trial. And we'll talk about that, what temptations look like, the process that James is going to talk about, and how you deal with that. So that even if you're tempted, you can count it all joy that you have faithfully and victoriously made it through that process. But we'll talk about that because that's important. That's a good question, though. It is at this point, it's a broad general brushstroke. That's true, and that's the way we face it as human beings. That if I'm suffering for a righteous cause, I can find some joy in that. But if I'm having to suffer for something I didn't ask for, and it doesn't have anything related to my stand with my faith, then think about all the families that lost their homes in the floods, lost their homes in LA, the fires. Boy, you talk about people having to go through all kinds of trials, and they don't feel like they deserved it. And that's a different kind of suffering and trials, but it's part of the big picture that he's talking about. He goes on to say, if you think about this process, the testing of your faith, when it's purified, and I wanted to say this, that in ancient Christianity, there was a strong teaching that would say this: testing purifies your motives, and it has a way of cleansing your soul. And they would think of it in those terms. But I like the idea of purifying your motives. When you go through something and you're tested, it makes you look inward to see, okay, what are my motives about this? How did I face this? And it makes you reflect on that. But he's going to say, there's a process now that's going to start. And this is going to help us answer the question, why do I have to go through trials and troubles and tribulations? Why can't I just live life without it? Oh, well, I'll raise this question. What would life be like if we didn't have any trials? You might say heaven. Well, maybe because you said that, part of God's divine plan is that we don't experience life with no troubles because we're waiting, eternally in God's presence for heaven. But what James is going to show here is that there's something extraordinary that happens when we allow trials to function in our life the way God would desire that they function. It makes us stronger. I saw yesterday something I didn't know was possible. There's a rare disease that with any little pressure on your bones, they break. And I saw where a mother was talking about that the child born at the hospital, how much its skull was crushed just through the birth process. And the doctor said this is so bad that why don't you just leave the baby here to die at the hospital and you just go on home? And the mother said, no, I'm not doing that. Well, she took the baby home, nursed it. But part of the story was, and this baby they were interviewing who had grown up, I think they were like 14 or 15 years old at the time. But the experience of um, not having, I'm trying to think how to describe this, not having your bones fortified and strong like a normal person. Said one time, um, what was it? She threw an orange for her child to catch, and the child caught it, and it broke the wrist. And it's almost like your bones are paper thin. It's a rare disease. There's a name for it. Like that'd be a common name for it. There you go. But sometimes we take for granted, the calcium that it takes and how our bones are fortified. And often, and you've heard this, the more you use your muscles and your bones, the stronger they get. I just heard recently that the new smoking problem in our culture is people just sitting too long with their computer. That's a horrible thing for your health. You sit all day. And I don't think the human body was made to sit all day. That's what God made it. Well, let's look at the process. Notice if we allow ourselves to go through this, there is this steadfastness, or some translations say endurance. And this is very important in our Christian life because it gives us the ability, as we are facing our trials, if we're successful in facing a trial, it helps us stand firm, we endure, we persevere, and it gets us ready for the next time. And this is a process. Luke 8:15. The seed is the good soil. This is Jesus explaining the parable of the sower. These are the ones who have heard a word in an honest and good heart and hold it fast and bear fruit with perseverance. So when you hear the word and it bears fruit, it's not just bearing fruit, but you do it with perseverance. Romans 5:3. And not only this, Paul says, but we also exult in our tribulations. We rejoice in those, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance. So both James and Paul agree on this. There's something about standing firm during trials that brings about perseverance. And 1 Thessalonians 1:3. Constantly bearing in mind, Paul says, your work of faith and labor of love and steadfastness of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ in the presence of God our Father. So there is this, notice how it ties into even the steadfastness of hope. So you've got joy and hope that are part of facing trials and producing steadfastness. But the process doesn't end there. And think of it this way. It's going into spiritual warfare with your armor, but making it through the battle. So, and you get scars in the battle, but guess what? Because you've been through it, you know what it's going to be like the next time. And you're remaining steadfast and you're prepared. Notice the rest of the process. See, perseverance or steadfastness, when it has its full effect, two things: maturity and completeness. Remember, we talked about last week from the book of Matthew, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And if I quote to you Matthew 5:48, you're like, wow, how can I do that? If God's expecting me to be perfect, I'm in trouble. Well, the word basically means maturity, spiritual maturity. And think of how mature you have to be to finally get to the point where you love your enemies and you pray for them. I would say that's one of the hardest things in the Christian life to do. And without God helping us, I don't know that we can do that. But you're most like God when you're able to love your enemies and pray for them. And that's the same word here, spiritual maturity. Think about how going through hard times helps you grow spiritually? And here'd be a neat question that we can ask. In what way do you grow spiritually through hard times? Have you thought about that? In what way do you grow spiritually?
Letting go of our will and letting God's will be done.
Okay, we give up our will and see God's will in it. Yeah.
I think your strength and faith in God becomes stronger because he is at least walk with you through those trials. And so you become stronger in your faith. And not only that, I'm thinking about, and going back to the steadfastness and persevering, is thinking about if I face a heavy trial and go through it, what effect does it have on those that see me and that I go through? And how much does it help them and their faith?
You know, that's such a wonderful insight. All of us sitting here can think this morning in our past, a Christian brother or sister, and we saw them go through a particular hard time and the impact that made on us. That's a great insight, because we all can think of somebody real quick and we admire how they stood up during that trial. And in our mind, we're like, okay, if I ever go through that, I want to be like that. and we'll say that to ourselves. Now, he also says to be complete, so that when we allow this process of maturing to keep on going, it's such a powerful one that he says we won't lack anything. Really, that's a pretty strong statement. So if I allow trials and obstacles and difficulties and tribulations and trouble and all of that to have its work in my life the way God hopes that it will, if I allow that process, I'm going to end up spiritually not lacking anything. That's a powerful statement. And it took me years for that to sink in, because there's a part of me, still probably a little part of me, that when I go through hard times, I want to resist that. Like, okay, how can I get around this? And what we'll do is think, okay, how can I avoid it? How can I resist it? When really, at a certain level, God's wanting us to face it, not deny it, but face it, and allow ourselves to go through the process so that we end up spiritually not lacking anything. I mean, this it took me quite a few years. Probably for me, I think it first dawned on me the level that I never knew before. In what was it, 2012? Or no, 1992. So wow, 1992. When my father committed suicide. Going through that, it made me realize that some of my old ways of thinking didn't help me at all. I wasn't prepared. And when we go through crises in life, if we're open to it, God can use those for our own inner growth. Now, and you may have heard this, when you face trials, you end up with two choices. Where you're going to end up. You're either better or you're bitter. And I've seen people on both of those. And it's sad to see people go through life, even as they get older, they don't allow God to work through those trials, such that as they get older, they become bitter. And you may have seen older people that are bitter, and that's not a pretty sight. I can't imagine the golden season of your life facing the end of your life being bitter. You know, I don't even want to go there. Okay, so our time is up. This is going to lay the ground for a whole lot more that we want to talk about in James. So thank you all for being here. And Richard, thanks for all of your group being here with us this morning during Bible class.